Shalom, good afternoon, Salam Alaikum, and Dobry Вечер. And these languages are chosen for a reason. They're the four languages most commonly heard and spoken in Israel today: Hebrew, English, Arabic, and Russian. I am so happy to welcome you. My name is Maxim Shrayer. I'm a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish Studies, and I chair the Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies. This is a brief introduction which precedes the formal introduction. And we're very, very happy to have Professor Ilan Troen here at Boston College. And I just want to say that a number of officers and a number of people worked very hard on making this happen, and I would like to acknowledge them. The Institute for the Liberal Arts and Professor Mary Crane, the Jewish Studies Program, and Professor Matt Zienkiewicz. And as a side note, we started Jewish Studies here at BC in 2005. I remember this well because our older daughter was born in 2006, and I remember my wife, quite pregnant, going to the launch of the Jewish Studies. And we now have over 20 Jewish Studies concentrators, which is, I think, an all-time record for Catholic higher education. And so Jewish Studies, the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, and Professors Daniel Jocelyn Smitkovsky and Ruth Langer, program in Islamic Civilization and Societies, and Professor Kathleen Bailey, the Department of Theology, and Professor Andrea Vicini, SJ. And last but not least, our own home department, Slavic and Eastern Languages, Southern Eastern, it used to be Slavic and Eastern Languages, it's now actually Eastern Slavic and German Studies, and Professor Franck Salameh, who will be the introducer. But I just want to add also a word of thanks, a note of thanks to BC Police, our good friends at these events, and to media services. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my very good friend and colleague, Franck Salameh. Many of you know him. He's one of the pillars in the teaching of Near Eastern Studies and Jewish Studies here at Boston College. Franck has been with us not as long as I have, which is 30 years, but for almost 20. And just one word of congratulations. Franck is the recipient of this year's Bernard Lewis Prize, which is awarded. It's a very, very special prize by the Association for the Study of Africa and the Middle East. And Franck is this year's recipient for a remarkable, brilliant essay on the new anti-Semitism, if I could put it this way. And Franck, please take it away.
Thank you, Professor Shrayer. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Professor Ilan Troen, for being here. Those of you who don't know Professor Troen, he's a distinguished scholar and I would say an elder statesman of Middle East studies and Israel studies. He has guided and inspired generations of students and practitioners of the Middle East. I would say in the true sense of, in the true etymological sense of the word history, teaching by showing. His example has been a great one. He's from the world whence I come. He's not someone who needs an introduction, much less my introduction, but I'll just mention a few lines from his extensive and expansive resume. Professor Troen is Emeritus of the Stoll Family Chair in Israel Studies at Brandeis University. He's founding director of the Shusserman Center for Israel Studies, also at Brandeis, the Lopin Chair of Modern History, Ben-Gurion University. He is former president of the Association for Israel Studies, Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and director of the Ben-Gurion Research Institute and Archives at Sede Boker in Israel. Professor Troen is also founding editor of the Journal for Israel Studies, recipient of the Association for Israel Studies Lifetime Achievement Award, and a prolific historian who has authored, co-authored, and edited a dozen books and scholarly articles on American Jewish and Israeli history. Beyond his scholarship and vocation, teaching and inspiring scholars, Professor Troen is the patriarch of I would call it a clan of peacemakers, family members, and fan clubs of followers, myself included. As you will be able to tell once he begins speaking, he grew up in the South End of Boston. One of his childhood friends was a man named Khalil Gibran. Those of you who might have heard the name, it's not the Khalil Gibran you might have heard of, but he's the nephew and godson of the artist and the mystic. So this is to tell you that he grew up in this sort of environment of mysticism and old world wisdom and peacemaking. Professor Troen raised a large family and guided a large cohort of followers and students in this tradition of peacemaking, adhering in a sense to the Jewish principle of tikkun olam, healing the world, but also being here at BC, I think he had a strong connection also to Boston College and to the kind of ecumenism and dialogue of cultures that is fundamentally Catholic and that we appreciate here at Boston College. So as I said, in the world from which I come, he doesn't need an introduction, but we couldn't have him speak here without saying a few things about him, tooting his horn, because I know he would not do it himself. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure being here and a privilege. What Franck neglected to mention among all those encomiums is that it took me the longest of anybody probably in the world to walk a few blocks from 1615 Commonwealth Avenue, where my parents lived, to BC. I had to go all over the world, including in Israel, but it's so nice to finally make it. Along the way, I had the pleasure of coming here on one other occasion, and that was to meet Ruth Langer, who it really brought me into a seminar that of which this book is a product. This was it was a seminar run by Philip Cunningham, and it was about Christian-Jewish relations, but it opened my mind up to trying to put the kinds of subject matter that I deal with within the context of the other religions who impact so much on and who are resident in the land in which I now live, which is not Newton, not Andover, but is Beersheba in the southern part of Israel. One other thing, it isn't the 27th of November. It's the 17th. But this book has another origin. I finished it actually before the 7th of October, but I pulled it on the 7th of October, 8th of October, because that was a date that impacted mightily on my family and on myself and my wife, who's here. It was the date, of course, I don't have to tell you, the date of the massacre, the terrible events of October 7th, and in the picture is a picture of our daughter and son-in-law who were killed at 7:50 in the morning on October 7th. That really fits with what I want to say, because they were among the founders of a school called the Hagar School. Mind you, I live in the city of Abraham. The city was not called Abraham's School. It was not called Sarah's School. It was called Hagar, his other wife. And it was a school in which Christian, Jewish And Muslim children went to school, and learned Arabic and Hebrew. So there was a fundamental ecumenicism built into the lives of our children who suffered October 7th. And much of what I want to say is there's a lot of negative things, but ultimately, as I'll say at the end, there was a potentially positive thing. The kind of optimism that they had about living in the land that's holy to three faiths is something which they communicated to their children and even to their parents. So that's their grave, and I just want to, for those of you who know Hebrew, you can read it. It has, I don't have a pointer, do I? But that's all right. It has their name, it has their the family place, it has what they did, and it explains that they were taken before their time, prematurely, and then it has the musical bars of the song they sang at their wedding. What's important about this is not what's on the stone, but what isn't on the stone. On the stone, it is not written, hey, you dullard, that may God avenge their deaths. Not because we don't believe in God, but because it's hard to understand how God would have been involved in the events of October 7th, nor do we actually believe that God is going to achieve justice in the future, and we just didn't want that as a way to remember that. Now, this is important because our daughter was buried about 150 meters away from my grandmother, for whom I'm named.
Your mother.
No, my mother is buried, right, this is my grandmother's grave, and I wish I could speak the Polish, Ukrainian, or Russian that she spoke, and that I heard growing up in Boston, of all things, because she was killed in 1919 in a pogrom. And growing up in Boston, I learned that one of the first things that went on to say in continual things is never again. I never again believed that it would happen. And somehow the fact that she is buried close to where her great-grandmother, I can't get the relationship straight, her grandmother is buried, suggests that there are certain continuities in experience, and one of them is the animosity and the tragedy and the fate of Jewish people. But this is not a morose presentation. The central theme is how to claim territory, how to claim land. And the Holy Land is claimed by many people, billions of people around the world. It's the Terra Sancta, it's the Holy Land in Arabic, and it's the Holy Land in Hebrew. And it is a land in which people throughout the world are invested in. That's maybe why there is so much intense interest. It's one of the largest press corps in the world, not because what happens there is so sensational, but because people care about what happens there. And what I want the statement that comes out of that is that the issue of claiming the land was settled a long time ago. It was 2 centuries ago and more, and 3 centuries ago or more. It was the homeland for the Jewish people. It then became the foundation point for Christianity, and in the 6th or 7th century, it became also a place associated with Islam. All 3 are connected to it. All 3 claim it. But that discussion of claiming subsided, and indeed was not mordant or not used, because it was beside the point. Muslims not only claimed, but had possession of the Holy Land from the 6th century, aside from the Crusades, the 2 centuries of the Crusades, and it was theirs. So what was there to discuss? What was there to argue about? But then something extraordinary happened. Balfour in 1917 conquered from Great Britain, a Christian country, the Holy Land and Jerusalem. Indeed, he was so religious, that the conquest was so associated with religion that the conqueror, General Allenby, got off his horse and walked in the old city like a pilgrim. It was understood to be a millennial event, an event of great significance. So this representative of a Christian power gave the land to a Jew, or to the Jewish people, or signed it. He didn't give it. What that means is that the kind of discussion that existed for centuries had to change. No longer would people talk about the Holy Land in terms of theology, although that remains. They talked about it in the ways you would discuss it in the academy, at the United Nations, in newspapers, in scholarly works, in public works. And it was not, the claiming of the Holy Land was no longer the preserve of the mosque, the church, or the synagogue. My paper here, or my discussion here, is how that transition is made from religious sites to secular sites. And my point is, as you will hear, is that they could not be disentangled. There is a tangle between theology and secular discourse. Examples. Hamas declares in favor of universal rights, but supports religious fundamentalists. And as you know, that the riots that took place here were not taken place only by Muslims. There were a lot of other people, certain kinds of Jews, many Christians. It was an event that was supported by secular modern people. The notion of colonial settler is also a form of what I will come to call, or you call, secular supersessionism. It is supersessionism. What it means is that the Jews should not be there. They have exited from history. They no longer have claim to the land. And that claims of theology are also find their way into thinking about Arab land and Jewish land. They're not entirely secular. And that rejection of Israel's legitimacy is very much expressed in theological positions and not only secular ones. It's not surprising. There was a great Jewish commentator, Rashi, who lived 1,000 years ago, who explained why the Bible begins, and God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz. He explains it because it's to show that God's creation is a portion according to his will. And you can read this, I don't have to read it, right? Yeah, you can read it in your own.
It's not in Hebrew.
I could read it and say it in Hebrew. He didn't want people to say this belongs to the 7 nations or to Canaan. It certainly, and he wrote this during the time of the Crusades, it didn't belong to the Christians. It really belongs to us. And how do we know? God told us. And he told us in the Old Testament. But what it really fundamentally means is that people who have faith throughout the world assign land to God's gift. You could be living in China, you could be living in Africa, you could be living wherever you live, have whatever faith you want, but the most common way of assessing to whom this land is given, assigned, is by looking into your faith. And it's not just the Jews, it's all. However, theology does not become the language after Balfour. There are other forms of claiming land, and the most well-known and probably most used forms were actually articulated in the United States in the early 19th century by Justice Marshall of the Supreme Court. And he laid out a theory of how lands would be assigned. First of all, by conquest. By the way, conquest as in international law lasts until the 1930s and 40s. The time when it begins to change is when the Japanese invaded Manchuria, and there was something called the Stimson Secretary of State Doctrine, and the United Nations in its opening statements argues that land cannot be acquired by aggression. The Chinese and the Russians today may not accept that entirely, but historically, that was a valid claim. And both sides, after 1917, there was an Arab army and there was a Jewish legion. Both of them claimed Palestine because they were involved in the sides of the conqueror. Treaties come out of conquest, but treaties can be retracted and changed, but that also becomes a way of claiming land. And I'll come to that a little bit later. So is discovery. Well, how could anybody discover the Holy Land? The answer is that we know the Holy Land is a site of sacred events, sacred presence. But nobody knew the depth of the Dead Sea until 1851. And people still look for oil and gas and other kinds of mineral deposits there. The North Pole wasn't discovered till around 100 years ago, nor Antarctica. And by discovering seas, or what's under the seas, becomes a legitimate legal way in which a nation may claim land or other territory. Labor. Labor is a very American idea. It comes from Locke. Locke claimed that there were 3 ways in which land could be claimed: by people who walk across, the nut gatherers, people who walk across and enjoy the fruit of the land; by shepherds who invest some labor in what it is that they do. And I can tell you that I was a shepherd once in my life, and the scariest part of it is trying to get them back in the corral or the pen. And the final way is by farmers. Farmers have more rights than shepherds. Shepherds have more rights than nut gatherers. And if you think of Thomas Jefferson, how did Americans really claim the Louisiana lands, the Midwest? How did they claim this continent? Or even the first governor of Massachusetts, Governor Winthrop, you can first find in his statements that anybody who comes into a wilderness can mark it off, farm it, and then it becomes his. Purchase. Hebron in the Bible was purchased by Abraham. Manhattan was purchased by the Dutch or English. Louisiana by the Americans. Alaska by the Americans. You can buy land, and that becomes a legal way. All these are historic categories that entered into international law in the 19th century. In the 20th century, there are new categories, and they in some ways are more vital and more referenced than that which came before. They include words like indigeneity, those people who were wherever it was first, have title. You no longer have a Columbus Day in Boston, do you? You have Indigenous Peoples Day. And we no longer have it at Brandeis because Indigenous people have rights. And that is superior to those who settled their lands than the colonial settlers, and is an anti-colonial view of how one claims land. Finally, the view that became important around the First World War, and President Nixon was one of those who explained it, or espoused it, it was through self-determination. Whoever happens to be there, and if they're there in large numbers, and if they organize and express themselves, they have rights to the land. Those rights can be enhanced if they happen to be indigenous, or if they've been there for a long time. And if they've been fighting out the foreign colonials, particularly if they're Western European or Americans, and can show that it is they who have a connection with the land. So all these are secular ways in which people claim land. God is not invoked. God is not invoked in the American Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, nor is he invoked in the Palestinian Charter, nor in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. God is kept out of arguments over ownership of land in the 20th century. Well, instances of tangles. I don't think that people actually expunged theology or religion, rather they merged. religious concepts with the new ones, the new secular ones. That was very much true in the capture, the conquest, the taking, the change of ownership of Palestine. And here I have several of notions in the debates that erupted after 1917, after Balfour. The resident population claimed that since the Balfour Declaration assigned the land to Jews only if it would not prejudice the rights and privileges of the population already there. That entered into the single most important debate of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And that was, but how many people could actually live there? And the initial thought was, well, 700,000 maybe. There were fewer people, I'll get to that later, there were far fewer people that centuries previous, and that bringing Jews to Palestine is going to prejudice the rights of Palestinians. And so keep them away. They will be intruders. So they argue for exclusion, the economic capacity of Palestine, and they invited experts to study this, and the experts supported their view. The Zionists also invited experts, and the experts supported their view. So the greatest debate of that period was who has the best experts and which experts are right. There's somebody who studies William Foxwell Albright that I met earlier. He argued, this was the great archaeologist from Johns Hopkins who argued in 1930 that there were 4 million people living in Palestine at the time of Constantine the Great. He probably has an exaggerated figure, but what he meant to say is that my reading of the Bible, of this land of milk and honey, is such that, of course, it supported many more people than at present, and there's no reason why one could not bring in those Russian, Polish, Eastern European Jews. The supporters of inclusion also use the Bible and history. And the Bible may have been, at one time, the most read book in human experience, and people reference that, the notion of, what do we call the land? The land we still retain, we live in Beersheba. And so there's an Arabic form of it. We have children who live in Gilo, which is an Arabic term. People who live in Jerusalem, which is shared by other people. There were 2,000 names in Palestine, Israel, which have their roots in the Bible. The Bible became an important reference point. History becomes an important reference point for those who claim the land. So history then becomes an important attribute. Let me tell you about one of them, because it's rather important. It concerns indigenous. Who's indigenous to Palestine and Israel? I'll come to that in another concept, another way, a little bit later. But the notion of indigeneity actually begins in the Central America in the 1950s, when there were some priests who were leftist leaning and who wanted to protect the natives from the rapaciousness of American capitalists like United Fruit, and they developed the notion of indigenous rights. Now, other people considered themselves indigenous before that, but the notion of indigenous rights entering into the international discourse begins in Central America, spreads to Australia and to New Zealand, and to America, where there are indigenous rights. In Canada was the First Nation, all kinds of lands where, and this is what it really means, where European colonizers, were Columbus, Cortez, and all those who followed them did not go. It really means the Third World. Indigenous rights are held for those parts of the world to which Western imperialism did not intrude. Who are the claimants? Who claims to be indigenous? In the Middle East, and around the time of Balfour, it was the Lebanese. And we'll have to ask Professor Salameh if he is in fact related to the ancient Phoenicians. Maybe he is. Or Egyptians, are they really present-day Copts? Are the Copts, are they really descendants of Pharaonic Egypt? Are the Turks, are they Hittites? If you go into the Central National Museum at Ankara, the first two huge rooms are devoted to Hittite archaeology. And they see themselves as referencing a pre-Christian and a pre-Islamic people who were in the Holy Land 3,000 plus years ago. Abraham buys that cave near Hebron from a Hittite. They are present in the sources. Jews also went back. They claim to be Canaanites, something they share with contemporary Palestinians. After 1967, there was a new way in which one references the past. And it happened with the defeat of Nasser, who advanced the notion of Pan-Arabism, for what Nasser was interested in was no longer viable. The Middle East broke up from the singular ummah, or nation, into nation states. And therefore, nation states developed their own indigeneity. What about the Hashemites who rule Jordan? If you would take a look at a dinar from 1967 onwards, you would find that the king of Jordan has one hand over El-Quds, over Jerusalem, and the other hand over the Nabatean city of Petra, because the historic role of the Hashemites in Saudi Arabia was that of protector of holy places. Now understand, the Hashemites are really an Arabian people. They came to Transjordan because the British brought them there, because they lost Arabia and that this was to be their condolence prize. The Palestinians claim that they are Jebusites. Now, the only people I know that remember the Jebusites for nearly 4,000 years are the Jews. They say Yevusi in the prayers at least 3 times a day, 4 times a day on holidays, but that makes no difference. If you're looking for ancestors, you will find them. And the Jebusites in recent Palestinian writings, historical writings, are seen as the proponents of the present day Palestinians. Christians too, they go back to Jesus. And as we'll come to talk about it, Palestinian liberation theology, they think of themselves as living stones, as the stones on which the new church will be built, and they claim direct connections with Christians who lived in the 1st century in Palestine. So there's the quote for liberation for theology, living stones, that they are descended from Jesus. And the only proof, it's not archaeological, nor is it found in paper and documents. The name of the leader is Naim Atik. Atik in Hebrew and in Arabic means ancient. That's enough to prove your lineage. And he is the author of a study guide called Zionism Unsettled, which claims that Jews are colonial settlers and makes the historical argument to support an anti-Zionist view. Mitri Rahab, who was a minister, a Lutheran from Bethlehem, proves my point. He termed what had to be done was theopolitics, that contemporary politics cannot ignore theology, and that the theopolitics of his movement, of his branch of Christianity, is to claim that Jews are really Europeans and that they are colonial settlers. Well, this claiming of the past is ubiquitous. The Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel begins with the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Almost right. Some of them lived in Ur-Kasdi, and were Chaldeans, and they came from wherever they came. But there they built their nation, their home. This problem with this Declaration of Independence, so let me tell you now, is that religious Jews will not accept this and will deny the validity of the Declaration of Independence because, as you see, I outlined, they Here, they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. As all of you true believers know, the Bible was given at Mount Sinai and at other occasions. So that's denied. But the point is here is they reference the past. Exile from Palestine, and you can read this yourself. There's a historic connection. What's interesting is that in the present, the Hebrew word is mistranslated. In the Declaration of Independence, it talks about God. It doesn't give his name. It doesn't say Jehovah. It says Tzur, which means rock, like the rock of ages, the rock of Israel. Well, in the contemporary, this year's translation from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, it's Tzur becomes Almighty God. And that really reflects is the increased influence of the Orthodox Rite in Israeli society, and not what the historic truth may be. The future vision of the Arabs, also that they are this is the fundamental document of contemporary Arab political protest. They are the indigenous peoples, all of them, except for the Jews. They are the Bedouins, they are the Christians, they are the Muslims, this kind of Muslim, that kind of Muslim, and they together are really the indigenous peoples, certainly not the colonial settlers. So then all theological religions use history, but all of them also use theology. And that's what I think I should talk about at Boston College. Let me share with you the variety of themes that one finds in the different religious themes. There is no one Jewish view, there is no one Christian view, there is no one Muslim view. Rather, it is what I call a tangle. And it is that tangle that I'd like to try to untangle for you. Judaism. Well, the place is certain. We know it's between, can I use the phrase, between the river and the sea? Between the river and the sea is the place, but actually the boundaries are inexact. Does it go from the Galilee to the Negev? Does it go beyond the river? How far, exactly where is it? Not sure. When was the promise that God gave that the Jewish people could return? Huge debate over that. And by whom? By a Messiah? Or may Jews come back on their own and earn their patrimony? For an example, the Haredi Jews believe this Zionist pioneer spirit story is nonsense. We Jews should all await the Messiah. And it's only when the Messiah comes may we all go back as promised. Then there are religious Zionists who say, no, you don't have to wait that long, because God knows when the Messiah comes back. And they use the phrase Reshit, the beginning of the redemption, and we may actually farm the land, and perhaps we can even hasten the coming. Then there's the Reform, who at least until the 1930s, Reform American Jews denied a connection to Palestine, for they did not want to be considered a people separate than the Germans or the Americans who hosted Reform synagogues. That's changed, by the way. Then there's Brit Shalom, who says, oh no, we don't have to worry about boundaries or time. We can come back, and we know where we're coming back to. But what we need to do is to create a binational state, because we can only re-inhabit the land if we do it ethically. And ethics, therefore, become how the land is to be retaken, becomes a crucial issue. And it is certainly an idea that informs many critics of the contemporary government and governments before it. Christianity. Oh, I'm bringing coals to Newcastle. But there are crucial issues of which there is enormous dissension. Does God still speak to the Jews? Meaning, are the promises that were made in the Old Testament still valid? Does God still have prophets? Does God still, is his word, is his promise to be kept? Hopefully, there was only one rainbow in history and there will not be another. But may the Jews return to the Holy Land. Did the coming of Jesus abrogate those covenants, and do they remain in force? Do the Jews still have a role in history? And if so, what is it? Do they still have a connection to the Promised Land, and what may it be? Those are the fundamental questions, and there are more answers than I could possibly convey to you in the several hours that I have to address you. For example, here's one of the dominant one, and I imagine one that the progenitors of the order that runs this university would accept historically, and that is St. Augustine, and you have his dates, argue that in fact God suspended his connection to the Jewish people. God does not speak to the Jews. He speaks to there's a new church, there's a new Israel. That is not an ancient idea. St. Augustine lived around the 3rd, 4th centuries. But you can find the Pope in 1904 saying, we cannot give approval to this movement, meaning Zionism. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never sanction it. And he goes on, as you can read, to give the fundamental statement why Catholicism opposed Zionism until recently. Jews have not recognized our Lord, we therefore cannot recognize the Jewish people. Makes sense. But here we find in the year 2000, Pope Francis at Yad Vashem. He's at Yad Vashem, lighting a candle, mourning over the demise of Jews, and celebrating a Jewish state. And the progress of how that happened is fascinating. As a matter of fact, my fundamental point is theologies were not static. Theologies of the 20th century changed as they confronted the need to find secular explanations for their role or their relationship to Israel-Palestine. For example, if replacement theology or supersessionism was the dominant theme from St. Augustine and later, it was not only the Pope at 1900, but it was the Pope Paul VI, who took only 11 hours. He didn't want to spend another moment in the land between the river and the sea. And he never once uttered the word Israel. He never once greeted the prime minister and the president who came bringing him water and salt, traditional kinds of signs of hospitality. It took until John Paul II, who visited not for 11 hours, but for 5 days. And it was he who recognized Israel, and it is he who we saw in the previous slide, coming to commemorate, memorialize at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. There's somebody whom, thanks to Ruth, I met, John Polakowski, who was a theologian at the seminary in Chicago, who is typical of a branch that developed before, but largely after 1964. And they took seriously Nostra Aetate, that the Jews are not culpable of deicide, that they in fact live in history, and that we can find the appropriate way in which we relate to them. And John urges, therefore, the notion that there are multiple covenants. God needs only one covenant. God is capable of many. He can relate to all peoples, not just one. However, you should know historically, it's an interesting fact that people talk about the two-state solution. In fact, you should know that there was a three-state solution. In 1948, Palestine was divided into, like Gaul, in tres partes. It was divided into 3 parts. There was the Jewish part, the Arab Muslim part, and the Christian part. The Christians didn't have people on the ground, the Jews and Muslims did, and they didn't have armies, the Jews and the Muslims did. And but therefore they used the United Nations to give them a piece of sacred territory, and they did it by creating an envelope around Jerusalem and making that an international condominium. that didn't work because the two other partners to this event didn't allow it to happen. And but there you are. Practicality can also affect how what arrangements are made. There are other Christian areas. Evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is probably the single most important force in American Christianity that is pro-Zionist. And there you have the proof of it, if you like. If you saw, and I saw, the transfer of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The first invocation was given by the pastor of a 15,000-member church in Texas. The next one by a 22,000-member church in San Antonio. And the evangelicals in this country have formed the single largest fundraising and membership community in support of Israel. It's likely that the Balfour Declaration would never have been given had there not been a particular constitution of the British cabinet in 1917. Most were evangelicals. And it so happens that the embassy would not have been moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem had not the President of the United States been so enveloped in by evangelicals. And they give more money than any Jewish charity, any federation, to the state of Israel. And when you exit an airplane at Tel Aviv airport, you will see in the sleeve pictures of ways in which Christians provide support, comfort, charity to Jews who have suffered, whether they're leaving the Soviet Union, whether they're wounded, whether they need this kind of assistance or that kind of assistance. What about mainline Protestants? What about the Methodists, the Presbyterians? They have their own views. And what's fascinating is that they developed a receptive theology in the 1920s and particularly the 1930s. And the first one is an English Anglican by the name of Parks, who developed the notion of that there has to be conversation between Jews and Christians. And you see up there the notion of the double covenant, again, foreshadowing what Pawlikowski had to say later on. But that's a real revolution in Christian theology. So much so that Parks was, if not ostracized, deeply criticized within his own church for, particularly with the rise of Nazism. He thought that Christians ought to be receptive to the notion of saving Jews rather than participants in their destruction. And as you can see, he wrote in one of his books, I see Judaism and Christianity as equals. What a revolutionary concept that is. Here is my favorite individual. His name is Reinhold Niebuhr. People don't read him anymore, but when I went to college, there were still people in sociology and political science courses who sometimes carry the book Moral Man and Immoral Society under their arms. Who was Reinhold Niebuhr? The slide shows that he made the cover of Time magazine in March 1848. If you read the analyses of the United Nations commissions on what would be the future of Palestine, he was accorded greatest respect of all the other those who brought testimony. But he argued for a Jewish state. What's interesting, he gave a Christian view of why there had to be a Jewish state that had nothing to do with St. Augustine and nothing to do with supersessionism. It had to do with the notion of original sin, is that man can act in ways that are very unbecoming, immoral, and the societies we create may be immoral, and that as he grew up as a pastor in the United States in the 20s and 30s, he thought that Hitler's Nazism and later on communism were the worst ideologies that one could imagine and were fundamentally sinful for the way in which they related to other human beings. And therefore, as a Christian believer, he supported the idea of a Jewish state. Understand that he was the only person that I think the Hebrew University ever gave an honorary doctorate to who did not come to Jerusalem. The doctorate was given in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where the rector and the president of the Hebrew University traveled to give him in person the doctorate. And one of the people in attendance was a great American cartoonist. And I wish that he were arrived to scribble down what took place, but we do have the notes that Reinhold Niebuhr made, and what he essentially says in a very short but very moving speech, I am a Hebrew. His view of being a Christian, a Protestant, was such that he went back to the sources and thought what being a Hebrew might mean in the contemporary world. He was the Billy Graham, the you choose your name. He was the single most important Christian leader in America in the 1950s to the end of the century, and the people like Johnson and so on. What about the influence of politics? Well, here is the cover of a book by Harry Truman. Now, you may have read that the Jewish lobby is very important, and maybe it is, but it impacts and shapes policy. But here's the man who actually recognized Israel. And how did he do so? He was a Baptist from Missouri and belonged to the Southern Baptist denomination. He never explained why he recognized Israel almost immediately and began a pro-Israel policy. But in a book written for him, about him, by a historian, it was titled, I Am Cyrus. And who is Cyrus in history? That after the first exile, it was the Persians, present-day Iran, that's a historical joke, that returned the Jews to the Holy Land. And so he said, I'm a modern-day Cyrus, I'm a modern-day Iranian, I'm a modern-day Persian, and I support a Jewish state. Islam, I'm not going to teach Islam here. There are some people who do it far better than I would ever try. But Islam, in Islamic theology, classical theology, the world is divided into spheres or abodes. There's the abode of Islam, there's the abode of war, and then there's the abode of the nations that are close by who are non-aggressive. They controlled Palestine for 13 centuries. How could that change? What would one find within Islam? It was Zionism that posed a challenge not to Christianity, it posed a challenge to Islam above any other people. And it is no surprise that Islamic countries, Islamic people, would be in the forefront of those who object to Zionism and who would see Jews as colonial settlers, non-indigenous, non-believers and the like, or to use the language of the Quran, that they would be apes and pigs, and that they are perfidious. They even built the golden calf. They rejected their prophets. Don't trust them. If you read within Islamic history, you read about instances like Khaybar, where Muhammad initially had a treaty with the Jewish community there, and later on was forced, or at least believed, that they ought to be destroyed. In short, by the way, Khaybar is the slogan that is used to this very day. If you look at Egyptian television around the time in the springtime, generally, you will find Khaybar remembered. Or when you find soldiers going to battle, they will explain that they are reliving Khaybar. To give you another example, the greatest general over the last millennium was Saladin. When Nasser took the name or the adjective of Saladin, the great hero of the Islamic world who conquered the Crusaders. And he did so at a place called Khitin in the Lower Galilee. Arafat, was celebrated as the modern Saladin. What I'm trying to say here, and it's one of the books I did, History, Arabs and Jews, Past, Real, and Imagined, is that both Jews and Christians and Muslims, for whom religion is alive, and even for those who religion isn't so pertinent, reference the past. The past is present. And so Kaibar, the way to interpret the incursion of Jews into Palestine is by invoking Kaibar and the Crusaders. The Zionists are really modern day Crusaders. We're going to get rid of them, even as we did so a millennium ago, and so on. So how do you explain that Saddam came to Jerusalem in 1977 and said, no peace, no war. There will only be peace with us in the Jewish state. He was a believing Muslim. So Islam also changed. And here you have what I think is the fundamental statement. It is a quote from the Imam. That's the bishop, if you will, of Al-Azhar University. That's the key Muslim university in Cairo. And as you will see, if you read this on your own, Islam is a religion also of peace and security, that we will not make war against those who don't make war against us. Of course we can have a treaty with the Jews. Of course we can have relationships with them. And he ends, if they incline to peace, incline thou also to it, and trust in Allah. That is a revolutionary statement for which Sadat paid for his life. He was killed by fundamentalists, assassinated by fundamentalists, even as Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, was killed by a fundamentalist. There are always elements of religions that have diverse strands, that have within them a group, often hopefully a fringe group, that try to master central territory and that claim that they have the truth that works. Here is the Hamas Charter. Those of you who believe that Israel ought to be supported, the fundamental charter written in 1988 says that we will obliterate Israel. Muslims should fight and kill Jews. There's no solution for the Palestinian problem except by jihad. Initiatives, proposals, international conferences about a waste of time, exercise in futility, and so on. You can have a treaty with them. This hudna, as it's called, is only temporary. Break it when it's convenient. So peace with Israel is not a theological possibility. So, and I don't know how to get to the next slide, but I should be able to do so. It's stuck. Well, I can tell you what's there. Can you do that? Can you change that? And press this? Oh, because I have something very important coming up. No. Am I good? Okay. There we go. How can you explain that a whole variety of Islamic states have made peace with Israel, or at least have relations with Israel? The so-called Abraham Accords, which our president has fostered. That there are relations with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, Morocco, and possibly Indonesia, with Kazakhstan, which is not up there. And that there might be relations with Saudi Arabia. And what's more, that in Israel, there is a fundamentalist Muslim group headed by Mansour Abbas. It's the northern branch of the Islamic movement, who argues there, and if you could read the statement, he argues there that Islam is a religion of tolerance and of peace. And I reach out my hand in my name and that of my colleagues and on behalf of the public that voted for me to create an opportunity for coexistence in this holy land, blessed by three religions and home to two peoples. In 1917, that would have been unimaginable. What this suggests is all religions have changed in the 20th century, in the lifetime of your grandparents or great-grandparents. They all have developed they've adjusted their theologies to deal with a present reality. What this is very interesting. It is a history of who actually lived in the Holy Land, from the river to the sea for the last 2,000 years. And as you will see, that the majority of the early centuries, when Christianity was only forming, were Jews. And their numbers were not terribly large, 1,250,000 at 2,000 years ago. They then overtaken by the Christians during the time of Constantine. And they become the majority. And you have the numbers in front of you there. And then the Muslims take control. And they, from the 6th century till near the present, it is they who govern the Holy Land. It is their land. Possession is 9/10 of the law. But notice the number of Muslims. In a conversation with a Muslim colleague, he said, you know, my family has been living in this village for 26 generations. But that is unique, because for 5-6 centuries until the present, the land from the river to the sea only had 200,000 people. It had more people in the ancient world than certainly in the more recent past. Today, there are not 700,000 people as there were at the time of the First World War or right after, but 14 million people. It's perhaps the place in the world which proportionately has grown more than any other place on the planet. And about half those people are Muslims and Christians, and the other half are Jews. So the land, the economic absorptive capacity of Palestine has been proven to be extraordinarily expansive. I want to give you some sense of what the land really looks like. This is Beit Sha'an. The Beit Sha'an was the head of the episcopate of the Catholic Church around the 5th century. But it had a stadium that could hold 5,000 people. Beit Sha'an had 2,000 people in 1900. It had 5,000 in 1950, and it has tens of thousands today. The city in which I live, Beersheba, there's no castle, there are no walls. There are no markings of great archaeological sites. As here, this was the theater of Beit Sha'an. That was a mosaic. It was a rich community. And if you could make out what the mosaic is, it's agriculture. It was the breadbasket of that part of the world, one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. And then it declined. That's Tel Aviv. About 4 million people live in Tel Aviv and around. And Tel Aviv once started as Sheikh Yunus, a small Palestinian village. When in the winter, when the rains came in that part of the world, the roads were so impassable that you would take a boat from Jaffa or Tel Aviv to Haifa or Acre. You had to go by sea rather than have your wheels stuck in the sand. But now here's a modern city. This is my town, Beersheba, at the beginning of the century. The only buildings is a school for the Sheikh's children, and it was built like Fort Leavenworth. It was built in short as an advanced station because the Turks and the Germans knew that the British would come up from the canal and try to conquer the Holy Land. That's Jerusalem. You know what's important about this picture? The tree. This is taken from a postcard in the 1870s. There's nothing around Jerusalem. No buildings, no city, and you've all seen pictures of the city except a lonely olive tree on Mount Scopus near the site of the Hebrew University and near the site of the Mormon University. And in between that, the land is filled with a Lutheran church and a Russian Orthodox church and thousands of people. So the land has developed in the 20th century. Not only has theology changed, But theology has tried to take into account the changes taken into the ground. I'm going to skip this. This is old wine in new bottles. That many of the arguments that I presented to you are found in what's called warfare or lawfare, various charges and so on. And come to a final point that I wish to make, next to the last point. The next to the last point is extremism is not only found around Hamas and not only found in other religious groups, it can also be found in a Jewish group. These are the guidelines of the present government of Israel. The Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop settlement in all parts of the land of Israel, the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, Judea, and Samaria. What I've tried to suggest is not only are there many historic claimants, many important theologies, but many important realities. Who are the indigenous of that land from the river to the sea? Many diverse peoples, many diverse cultures. That's the way it was in the past. And the notion that this can be exclusive to any one people is probably contrary to reality and to possibility. Yet that exists also within the state of Israel. Hopefully it will be a government that I can vote out of existence. An observation. The first debate over Zionism was over a word, and the word was öffentlich, openly or publicly in the present translation. That the first sentence in the Zionist charter was to seek and secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured homeland in Palestine, Basel, 1897. The debate was over a small minority that said, we can't do that, we can't be Zionists, we can't call for mass immigration and rebuilding the country in our image. We can't do that because look how we existed over history. Over history, we sought the intervention of the powerful lord, the king, the bishop, the aristocrat, those who had real power. The kind of people who would do that are known in the literature as court Jews. And let us trust in our ability to persuade, to have a Jewish lobby. But the Zionists wanted something else. They wanted legal recognition. They wanted public acknowledgement of their right to be there. And it was that position that won a ultimately unanimous vote at the first Zionist Congress. I would argue that's still an issue today. There are some people who don't care, who think we have a right alone. It's our right that we know it's ordinated by God, and it's justified by secular arguments. His land is ours, and that's probably not the way to maintain a presence in the Holy Land, neither for them nor for any other group. What I've tried to show, whoops, I lost it, is an image. Is an image of a warp and a woof. And if you people knit, so you know what a warp and a woof is, though it's not a knitting. Knitting, I know, but that's the closest I could come to it because who makes fabrics these days? A warp and a woof, those that when you make a fabric, you put the horizontal threads and the longitudinal threads. And the art of the person, the weaver, is to weave them together and to make a fabric. What I've really been trying to say to you in this not so eloquent but nevertheless serious presentation is that there are the theological arguments and the secular arguments. And they can be woven together in many different ways. And to tell you a personal story that really gets to that logic is that I had the opportunity to present Mandela in South Africa with an honorary doctorate on behalf of Israeli universities. And in order to do that, I read as much as I could by him and on him. And when I got to Cape Town, South Africa, I was sent to Robben Island which is a rock outcropping in the ocean beneath Cape Town. And if you think that there's something to the south of you, even though you have third-grade geography, you know you're going to fall off the earth. So instead you look to the north and you see the beginnings of a magnificent continent that ends in the Mediterranean. And on that rock, for 18 years or so, Mandela lived and contended each and every day with his captors who tried to dehumanize him and his fellow prisoners. What's remarkable is at the end of that period, he got out of captivity and he came up with the idea of a rainbow coalition of truth and reconciliation. In short, as he took the threads of his life, both as a believing Christian and also as an African, he wove them into a pattern of justice as he understood a possible community of reconciliation and so on. You can take everything I've said to you and you can make your own pattern, your own textile. It could be one of extremism, it could be one of accommodation, it could be one of peace. The arguments over the Holy Land are so varied, come from so many different sources, that it is up to you to choose and to make of them what you will.